At 42 years old, Temperance Wray owned nothing in the world but a tin trunk, $11.40 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and the clothes on her back. Her brother-in-law, Silas Wray, had stood on the porch of the homestead she had shared with his brother for 18 years and told her, without once meeting her eyes, that the debts against the place were his now to settle, and that she would do better to find lodging in town. She did not argue. She had learned by then that arguing with a man who already held the paper in his hand only wasted breath she could not spare. So she walked the 4 miles into Amity Flat with her trunk on a borrowed cart, and 3 weeks later, standing at the edge of a rail yard sale of junk and scrap, she spent 4 of her last dollars on a locked railroad car that no one else wanted, a rusted, windowless relic shunted onto a dead siding behind the depot, sealed shut since before she was a bride. Folks called it foolish. They said she'd bought herself a coffin of rotten wood. They did not know that behind that seal was something that had waited 30 years to be found, something that would not only change the shape of her life, but would settle a debt the whole town had been carrying without ever knowing its weight. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Temperance Wray. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a town, a home, a season of your own life, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Temperance had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised on the edge of Amity Flat by her grandmother, Eula Vance, in a 2-room house that smelled of cedar shavings and lye soap, and it was Eula who had taught her the one skill that would matter more than any other, though neither of them could have known it then. Eula was a quilter, and not the ordinary kind who worked in matched calico from the dry goods store. Eula worked in scraps, the burnt corner of a tablecloth, the good half of a shirt worn through at the elbow, a wedding dress no bride would ever wear again because the groom had died of fever before the vows were spoken. She would sit by the stove of an evening with a basket of what other households called ruin, and she would turn it, piece by piece, into something whole. The world throws away twice what it keeps, Temperance, she used to say, snapping a thread between her teeth, and most of what it throws away only needed someone patient enough to look at it twice. Temperance's father, Nathaniel Vance, had been the bookkeeper for the Concord and Western Railway office in Amity Flat before consumption took him when she was 16, and from him she had learned the second skill that would matter: how to read a column of figures the way another person read a face, how to find the place where a ledger did not sit easy, where a number had been asked to say something it did not mean. Between her grandmother's needle and her father's pen, Temperance grew into a woman who could not look at a broken thing without wondering what it had been meant to be. She married Jacob Wray when she was 24. In the spring, the town finally got its second church built, and if there was a happier match in Amity Flat in those years, no one could recall it. Jacob ran a modest dry goods store on the east side of the square, and Temperance kept his books the way her father had taught her, catching a supplier's overcharge here, a miscounted crate there, until the store's small profit became a steady one. They never had children of their own, a sorrow they carried quietly and without complaint, but they filled the house with other things, with the stray dogs Temperance fed on the back step, with the mending she did for widows who could not pay, with the long evenings when Jacob read aloud from whatever paper had last come up the line while she stitched by the lamp. Jacob's younger brother, Silas, was a different sort of man entirely, ambitious in a way that made people uneasy without their being able to say quite why, and he had gone off to Helena in his 20s to make his fortune in banking, returning to Amity Flat only after their father died, and left the 2 brothers a modest inheritance split evenly between them. Silas took his half and multiplied it through canny loans and canniness of another kind that people whispered about but never proved, until by the time Temperance was 40 he sat on the town council and held the mortgage papers on no fewer than 6 properties in the valley, including, though she did not yet know it, a portion of the note on Jacob's own store. Temperance was 11 the winter. A young widow named Sarah Nettles lost her husband to a rockslide up in the timber camps, and came to Eula's door with nothing to offer but a bundle of her late husband's shirts, too worn for wear and too dear to burn. Most women in town would have thanked her kindly and set the bundle aside. Eula spread the shirts across the kitchen table, turned each one to the light, and set Temperance to cutting squares from the parts that had not gone thin, the yoke of one, the tail of another, a good half-sleeve from a third, until by the following spring Sarah Nettles had a quilt heavy enough for the coldest nights, stitched through with the very cloth her husband had once worn to work, and she wept over it in a way that taught Temperance more about mending than any needle lesson ever could. It was that winter, watching her grandmother's hands move without hesitation over what other women called rags, that Temperance first understood value was not a thing fixed inside an object, but a thing a person chose to see or refuse to. She carried the lesson into her marriage without ever naming it as such. At the store, when a rancher's wife came in ashamed to trade eggs and mended linens for flour because coin was scarce that season, it was Temperance who quietly kept the ledger balanced in the woman's favor rather than turn her away. And it was Temperance, too, who talked Jacob into keeping a shelf of odds and remnants at half price, rather than sending them back east to be scrapped, so that families who could afford nothing new might still walk out with a good coat or a sound pair of boots. Jacob used to tease that his wife could find a customer for a one-legged stool, and there was truth enough in it that he stopped teasing after the third time she proved him right. It was Eula's teaching that Temperance leaned on hardest in those years, the patient conviction that a thing dismissed by the world was not the same as a thing without worth, and it shaped how she moved through Amity Flat, kind to the peddlers other wives turned away, generous with the seed corn she saved each autumn, unhurried in the way she judged a person before she judged them at all. She could not have said, watching her husband laugh over supper or hemming a coat some stranger's child had outgrown, that a day was coming when every one of those quiet virtues would be tested at once, and that the very patience her grandmother had planted in her would be the only inheritance left standing when everything else had been taken away. The fall, when it came the way falls in that country so often did, not all at once, but in a slow collapse that only looked sudden from the outside. Jacob took a chill in the winter of his 50th year that settled into his chest and would not leave, and though Temperance sat up with him through 6 weeks of fever, burning cedar and boiling broth and pressing cool cloths to his brow with the same steady hands her grandmother had taught her to sew with, he died on a Tuesday morning in February with the frost still thick on the window-pane. She buried him beside his mother in the churchyard he had helped raise the timber for, and she told herself, in the numb weeks that followed, that grief was the worst of what she would have to carry. She was wrong. Within a month, Silas Ray came to call, not as a brother mourning his brother, but as a creditor. He informed her, with the particular gentleness men use when they intend to be immovable, that Jacob had borrowed against the store 2 years prior to cover a bad shipment of seed, that the note had come due, and that as executor of their father's estate and holder of the debt, he had no choice but to take possession of both the store and the small house behind it in settlement. Temperance asked to see the paper. Silas produced it, and though something in the figures nagged at her the way her father had taught her to notice such things, she had no lawyer, no money for one, and no strength left after 6 weeks at a sickbed to fight a Ray in a town where the Ray name sat on the bank's letterhead. The town council, of which Silas was a member, ratified the transfer within the month. Neighbors who had eaten her bread for 15 years found reasons not to meet her eye on the street, and the reverend who had married her to Jacob offered only that the Lord's ways were not always plain, which struck Temperance in her grief as a poor kind of comfort. On the morning she was to hand over the keys, she walked once more through the small house behind the store, running her hand along the doorframe where she and Jacob had marked the height of every stray dog they'd ever taken in, and she allowed herself exactly 1/4 of an hour to grieve the walls themselves before she latched her trunk and would not let herself look back a second time. She moved into a single room above the boarding house run by a widow named Constance Pryor, A kind, spare woman who charged her less rent than the room was worth and never once asked why. And Temperance took in mending and laundry to keep herself fed. Her grandmother's old needle-finding work again, though not the work she would have chosen. She watched, from her narrow window above the square, as Sela's hung a new sign over the store that still bore her husband's name in the paint beneath it if you looked hard enough. And she made a private practice, in those months, of walking the long way around the square so she would not have to pass beneath it. There were nights that first winter when the $11.40 sewn into her petticoat felt less like savings than like the last measurable proof that she still existed as a person owed something by the world, and she guarded it the way another woman might guard a keepsake. By the time the rail yard held its scrap sale that spring, that sum was all she had left. Along with a trunk of clothes and a grandmother's needle, she had not had the full heart to use in a year. The sale had been called to clear the yard behind the depot for a new passenger platform. The Concord and Western was finally building after years of promises. And the station master, a weathered, kindly man named Abel Cutter, had gathered every piece of derelict rolling stock on the property to be sold for scrap lumber and iron. Most of it went quickly, and for little flat cars stripped for their boards, a rusted hand car bought by a rancher for parts. But there was one car at the end of the row that the bidders passed over entirely, a squat, windowless private car with its doors chained and padlocked, its once fine paint gone to a dull, weathered green, sitting on a spur track so overgrown with wild rye that its wheels seemed to be sinking into the earth itself. Cutter admitted, when Temperance asked, that the car had sat sealed since before he'd taken the station master's post, that it had come with some manner of old legal encumbrance attached to it from the courts in Helena, that nobody currently living quite recalled the particulars, and that the railway simply wanted it gone. String of bad luck on that car, he told her, not unkindly. Man who owned her disappeared some 30 years back, right around the Panic of '71, and nobody's had the stomach or the key to open her since. When the bidding opened at $1, the men around her laughed and moved toward the flat cars instead, muttering that rotten velvet and 30 years of dust weren't worth the trouble of the lock. And one rancher's hand allowed loudly that he wouldn't pay a plugged nickel to open a dead man's door and find out what had gone to rot inside it. Temperance found herself stepping forward before she had entirely decided to, the way a hand sometimes moves before the mind has finished its arguing. She thought of her grandmother's basket of scraps, of the twice-over glance the world so rarely gave, and of the particular stillness in Abel Cutter's voice when he'd spoken of the car, as though even he did not quite believe his own dismissal of it. She bid $2, then $3. A ripple of laughter went through the yard at that, not unkind exactly, but the laughter of people watching a woman spend money they assumed she could not spare on something they were certain was worthless. When a man finally shrugged and offered $4, thinking to strip it for the brass fittings alone, Temperance heard her own voice say $4.50, steadier than she felt, and the yard went quiet, and Abel Cutter, looking faintly amused, glanced once toward the sealed car as if reconsidering it himself, then brought down his gavel and told her the car was hers. It took her 2 days, and the help of a boy named Wilkie Pratt, paid in bread and a dime, to break the ancient padlock with a cold chisel borrowed from the smithy. When the door finally groaned open on its rusted hinge, a breath of stale, cedar-scented air rolled out to meet her, and what she saw inside stopped her on the threshold as surely as a hand against her chest. The interior had been fitted out once as a gentleman's private car, with velvet seats gone the color of dried blood beneath 30 years of dust, brass fixtures dulled to the color of an old penny, and a small roll-top desk bolted to the far wall beneath a shuttered window. Everything sat exactly as it must have been left. A coat still hung on a hook by the door, stiff with age, a pair of spectacles resting on the desk beside an inkwell gone dry as bone, and on a small shelf above the seats, a row of books whose spines had faded to the color of weak tea. A tin cup sat on the floor beside the stove, as though set down mid-sip and simply forgotten, and Temperance found herself moving through the car with the same hushed care she used in a sick room, as if the stillness itself were something that might be disturbed. Wilkie waited outside, unwilling, he admitted, to set foot inside a dead man's car even for another dime, and so it was alone that Temperance stepped further in, the boards creaking beneath her weight for the first time in 3 decades, and ran her fingers along the desk's roll top, until it gave way with a shudder of dust that caught the last of the daylight through the door and hung there, turning slowly, like something suspended out of time. Inside the desk lay a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with 2 gold initials worn nearly smooth. E.T. Beside it sat a small iron strongbox, locked, and a stack of yellowed papers tied with a ribbon that had once been blue, and tucked into a side compartment. A woman's cameo brooch that Temperance would later learn had belonged to no wife. For Ezra Thorne had never married, but to a sister who had died young, kept close by a man who did not, it seemed, let go of things easily. Temperance sat down in the dead man's chair, its velvet still holding, faintly, the shape of him, opened the journal to its first page, and began, in the fading afternoon light, to read. The name on the first page was Ezra Thorne, and the date beneath it was the spring of 1871. Temperance recognized the name the way one recognizes a word from a language half forgotten. She had heard it as a child, spoken in the hushed, careful tone adults use for a story they do not wish to finish in front of the young. Over the following nights, reading by lamplight in her room above the boarding house with the journal spread across her knees, she pieced together a history that Amity Flat had let itself forget. Ezra Thorne had been the financier behind the very rail spur that had first brought prosperity to the valley, a man who had made his fortune in silver claims further west and had chosen, in what his journal called the only decision of his life he was ever fully proud of, to sink a great part of that fortune back into the town that had given him his start. He had established what he called the Thorne Trust, funded by a share in a promising claim above the valley known as the Ridgeline Vein, with the interest set aside to build Amity Flat a proper schoolhouse and to provide a standing pension for its widows and orphans. A fund his own hand had written, so that no woman in this valley need ever again lose everything for the crime of outliving her husband. The journal named the town's young banker and rail agent at the time, entrusted with managing the trust's paperwork and disbursements, as one Augustus Wray. Temperance's hands went still over the page when she read the name, for Augustus Wray, she knew from her husband's own telling, had been Silas's grandfather, the very man whose modest fortune had seeded the Wray family's rise. The journal's later entries grew shorter, more clipped, edged with something that read, even across 30 years, like fear. Thorne had discovered a discrepancy in the trust's accounts, funds drawn against the widow's pension that had never reached a single widow, and confronted Augustus Wray directly. Within a fortnight, Thorne wrote, the town had turned against him instead, told by Augustus that it was Thorne himself who had embezzled the trust, that Thorne meant to flee with the Ridgeline claims proceeds and leave Amity Flat with nothing. A warrant was sworn out. Thorne's private car was seized by court order and impounded on the siding pending trial, its contents sealed as evidence in a case that Temperance would later learn from the yellowed newspaper clippings tucked among the papers, had simply gone cold when Thorne vanished during the blizzard of that November and was never seen again, presumed either fled or frozen in the high country, the truth of it lost with him. Beneath the journal, folded inside the ribbon stack of papers, she found a letter in Thorne's own hand, sealed and never sent, addressed to the widows and orphans of Amity Flat, and inside the strongbox, once she'd had a locksmith force the hasp, a deed to the Ridgeline claim itself, held in trust, along with a ledger in a second hand, Augustus Wray's own, whose figures, when Temperance laid them beside Thorne's, told a story her father had trained her eye to read as plainly as a confession. And in the margin of one page, in Thorne's smaller, more careful writing, a single line stopped her breath entirely. A note naming the family of Nathaniel Vance's own mother, her grandmother Eula, widowed young, struggling alone with a child, as among the very first widows the trust had been established to protect. Word of what Temperance had found did not stay quiet for long. Wilkie Pratt's mother worked laundry for half the town, and within a week the story of the widow and her locked railroad car had traveled from the boarding house to the barber shop to the pews of both churches. Most heard it as a curiosity, a strange bit of luck for a woman who had had precious little of it lately. Silas Ray heard it as a threat. He came to the boarding house himself on a Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, his manner pleasant in the way that had always made Temperance's skin prickle, and informed her that whatever she believed she had found aboard railway property legally impounded 30 years prior was, by any reasonable reading of the law, still the property of the Concord and Western, or failing that, of his own family, given that his grandfather had served as the trust's administrator, and any surviving assets would revert accordingly. Temperance told him, with a steadiness that surprised even her, that she would be glad to let a judge decide the matter, and something in Silas's face shifted at that, a flicker of the same fear she had read in Ezra Thorne's 30-year-old handwriting. In the weeks that followed, 2 of Silas's men came around the boarding house at odd hours, asking Constance Pryor pointed questions about her tenants' comings and goings. A clerk at the county recorder's office let slip to Wilkie's mother that someone had inquired, quietly and with cash-changing hands, about how a widow's claim to salvaged property might be voided on a technicality. Temperance found an ally, unlooked for in Wendell Hollies, the editor of the Amity Flat Clarion, a thin, ink-stained man who had covered the original Thorne disappearance as a cub reporter 30 years before, and had never quite believed the story the town had settled on. Hollies helped her cross-reference Thorne's journal against the paper's old files, confirmed the dates, the handwriting, the existence of the original warrant, and agreed to hold the story until she had gathered every proof she could carry, because a claim against a Ray, he told her plainly, would need to be unassailable before Amity Flat would believe it over a family that had sat on its council for 20 years. The chance she needed arrived with the dedication of the new depot platform that autumn, an occasion grand enough to draw a circuit judge, the Honorable Elias Prout, up from the county seat to speak, along with half the valley turned out in its Sunday clothes to watch the first train pull in under the new awning. Temperance stood at the edge of the crowd with the journal, the ledger, and Thorne's unsent letter wrapped in oilcloth against her chest. And when Judge Prout finished his remarks and the mayor called for any further business before the crowd dispersed, she stepped forward and asked, in a voice that carried further than she expected, to be heard. She laid it out plainly and without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to read a column of figures. Ezra Thorne's trust, the discrepancy he had found, the warrant sworn against an innocent man, the 30 years a sealed railcar had sat forgotten while a debt to the town's own widows went unpaid. She held up Augustus Ray's ledger beside Thorne's own, showed the crowd the matching dates, the matching sums, the places where one hand had tried to erase what the other had recorded honestly. Silas Ray, standing near the platform steps, went the color of ash and tried twice to interrupt before Judge Prout, who had presided over enough fraud cases in his career to recognize the shape of one when he saw it, told him firmly to hold his peace until the woman had finished. When she had, the judge examined the papers himself, questioned Wendell Hollies on the newspaper's old files, and ruled from the platform steps that afternoon that the case against Ezra Thorne, whatever had become of the man himself, was to be formally and publicly vacated, and that the Ridgeland claim, still held quietly in trust by the mining company all these years for want of a living claimant, was to be released at last to fund the Thorne Trust exactly as its founder had intended. The schoolhouse Ezra Thorne had dreamed of would finally be built. A standing pension was established for the valley's widows, the first disbursement of which Temperance insisted, over the objections of the council, be paid retroactively into the estate of Eula Vance, so that even in death her grandmother's name would be entered into the ledger Thorne had meant for her all along. Silas Wray resigned his council seat within the month, quietly and without public accusation, for Temperance had asked the judge to spare him the full weight of his grandfather's sins being read into the record. And in a final motion that surprised the whole town more than anything else that day, the store that had once borne Jacob Ray's name, along with the note against it, was returned to her outright, the debt itself found to have been calculated, upon Judge Pruitt's own review, in Augustus Ray's favor by a sum too convenient to be called accident. So it was that a woman who had walked into Amity Flat with a tin trunk and $11.40 to her name became, within the space of a single autumn, the keeper of a story the town had spent 30 years trying to forget, and the instrument by which it finally made itself right. She had not gone looking for Ezra Thorne's fortune when she bid her $4.50 that spring morning. She had been looking, if she was honest with herself, only for 4 walls that could not be taken from her by a man with a paper in his hand. But her grandmother had taught her, in a 2-room house that smelled of cedar and lye, that the world discards twice what it keeps, and that most of what it throws away only needs someone patient enough to look at it twice. And so it was that patience, not fortune, which had truly unlocked that railcar, long before the chisel ever touched the lock. Temperance Wray did not use what she found to make herself rich. She used it to build the schoolhouse Ezra Thorne had died still hoping for, to see that no widow in that valley would ever again lose everything for the crime of outliving her husband, and to prove, in the end, that a debt owed to the overlooked does not vanish simply because 30 years of dust have settled over it. Settle in and remember the name of the woman who paid $4 for a locked door and found behind it a debt the whole town had forgotten it owed. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Temperance's story. If it moved you, we'd be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people are so rarely as worthless as the world decides they are. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.